This will be probably, for many of you, the first and maybe the only opportunity to hear a sterling economist, well-known economist, who is also an Olympic fencer. And if I recall correctly, it was the saber, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, so don't mess with the guy. Mark is the, well, Mark, yes, is the professor of economics, University of Ottawa. He has been visiting professor at any number of distinguished universities, Bordeaux, Lyon, etc. And we don't have to go into the full details of those visiting positions. He's authored well over 100 articles in referee journals, 60 essays in collected, edited works. He has published 3 books, is it? By yourself, or one with Wynne, but...
By myself, I guess.
Well, let's see, I got Introduction to Post-Keynesian Economics, Foundations of Post-Keynesian Economics, and then Monetary Economics, and that was the one with Wynne Godley. Am I missing something?
I also published 2 books on the economics of ice hockey.
I'm sorry. And as a Montreal native, of course, ice hockey looms very large in his background. Anyway, the one suspicious point that I bring to your attention is that he is also author of the first edition of the Baumol and Grinder Canadian version of their textbook. And that should raise some red flags at a minimum, right? But in any case, I mean, compared to others, it wasn't that bad, but nevertheless.
Yeah, it was. The original one was one of the most Keynesian.
That's true.
The first year textbook.
And then the second and third edition became less so, if I recall correctly. Right?
Yeah. Well, they had eliminated the paradox of thrift, for instance.
Yeah. Okay. Well. Anyway, please welcome Mark, and he'll be speaking on the essentials of heterodox and post-Keynesian economics.
Well, thank you, John. I think it's about the 3rd time I've come over the last 3 or 4 years. I was at the Keynes conference here, here in downtown in September.
Is that September?
Last year?
Yeah. Yes.
Or was it the year before?
The year before. It'll be 4.
When you get older, time passes much faster. And I gave a lecture in this very room a few years back as well, a few years ago. So I'm very pleased to be here. I don't know where this thing is here. And I was very much excited to see how dynamic the students, I'm talking mainly of the graduate students that I met, was very much impressed, and I hope that this tradition is continuing, and I will find out, I guess, in an hour when you will be asking the questions, and later at the pizza place. Right. What I'm going to say, to some extent, you can find in the book which is shown there, which was the Introduction to Post-Keynesian Economics. I've just finished writing a second version, so to speak, of the book that I had back in 1992. This one is supposed to be around 700 pages. I don't suppose too many of you will be able to afford to buy it, but I certainly hope you will have it in the library. The book should come out this summer, but I haven't seen the proofs yet, so I'm still waiting to do that. Okay. Maybe by way of an introduction, I can say we can say that the global financial crisis has had an impact on a number of people. For sure it has had an impact on students of economics, has had an impact on journalists, reporters. You can see in the press they're slightly more open to alternative ideas. Trade unions now start to see mainstream theory with a different eye. I was asked, for instance, to write a chapter for a book that is supposed to be written for trade unions in Sweden. Central bankers, especially in the United States, have, I think we can say, have changed their minds considerably. And even at the IMF, there was a U-turn in 2009, end of 2008. There was another partial U-turn later around 2010, but I think that again the IMF is aiming more towards stimulus programs than it is aiming towards austerity programs. On the other hand, there are other people who have not changed very much. If you look at what the European Commission is writing, it I can always hold it. Yeah, certainly the European Commission has not changed, and I think it's fair to say that most of my colleagues, and in other universities as well, have not changed either, except for very few of them. For instance, well, John Henry here taught at McGill University, and there is a professor there who explained to me that he has now started a course on financial crisis, devoted entirely to financial crisis, where the students are asked to read books by John Kenneth Galbraith or well, Hyman Minsky, and there's another one, I forgot his name. Anyway, so a few people have changed, but not too many.
I don't think that mic is on.
This one?
No, the one you're holding.
This one?
Yeah.
You know, there's a green light. You wouldn't know? I mean, how would you know whether it's on or not?
It's not.
Huh?
It's not actually broadcasting.
Yeah, I don't worry about it.
Just set it on
Just
the.
put that thing down. Sorry about that.
All right. Okay, so here's a statement by fairly well-known statement. It's often mentioned by Willem Boyter, who used to be an economics professor and was also a former member of the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England. And this is what he had to say about American, well, economics programs in American universities. He thinks that we have been going in the wrong direction, except, of course, here and a few others, that we have been going in the wrong direction for the last 30 years. So what should we do? Well, certainly, I mean, I think most heterodox economists would like more space being given to their ideas, more space being given to those who dissent with mainstream economics. And there are movements in various universities in countries that you would not suspect of being heterodox, like in Germany and in Austria. There are groups of students who organize their own lectures, inviting heterodox professors because they can't get this sort of information in the courses that they take with their normal professors. And basically, that's the irony our neoclassical colleagues keep talking about. They keep talking about competition, but in economics there is very little competition. There's a quasi-monopoly. All right, so that's the introduction. So what am I gonna be talking about today? First, I want to express what I think are the main differences between heterodox economics and orthodox economics, and argue that it's a fair way to describe the field. And at the same time, I will try to pin down some further distinctions. Secondly, I'll be explaining, maybe I'm in the wrong place to do so, but I will try to explain what is my view of post-Keynesian economics. How does post-Keynesian economics differ from the other orthodox schools, heterodox schools, sorry, and what are the different strands in post-Keynesian economics. And finally, I have this question here: who's afraid of Virginia Woolf? Well, who's afraid of neoclassical economics? In the sense that, why is it that there's so much empirical work that seems to give support, provide support to neoclassical economics? And so I'll try to convince you that you should not be intimidated by this large amount of empirical work. Okay, so I start with the first part, and okay, here are a few synonyms, so to speak, in the way in which we can describe heterodox economics and orthodox economics. So again, here I think you would agree, we can talk of the dominant paradigm, the mainstream, neoclassical economics, marginalism. Fulbrook from England now calls this old paradigm economics. Some of my colleagues, especially those who do methodology, I think here of David Colander, John Davis, would argue that, neoclassical economics is not the right term to describe this dominant paradigm anymore. But in my opinion, the distinctions are not really worth making, and I'll try to make, as I said, pin down a further classification that should help us to differentiate between heterodox economics and orthodox economics. On the other hand, you have here all these different words that have been used recently to describe heterodox economics. At some point in my book in 1992, I used the word post-classical economics. It did not, in opposition to neoclassical economics. It did not really pick up. Just a few authors did so. As I was writing the new version of my book, some students said, maybe you should give the title Real World Economics instead of Post-Keynesian Economics. I have not been really convinced, and finally Fulbrook calls it New Paradigm Economics, just to make fun of the old paradigm economics. Okay, so the fascinating thing about heterodox economics is that there are many, many different schools. I mean, here I have a list of about 15 of them. I've put Post-Keynesians and Straffians on the top, not because those are the biggest groups. I think the biggest groups in terms of numbers would be the old institutionalists and the Marxist radicals. Perhaps today also there's a lot, big group would be feminist economics and ecological economics. But then post-Keynesians would probably come right after that. And there are even, Gandhi economics, Henry George economics, Geselian economics. There are associations devoted to Gesell. And then, things like system dynamics, should that be considered to be heterodox? Well, some people believe that yes, it is. Agent-based modeling, there's a big discussion, is that part or not of heterodox economics? And in the book, well, I just have a couple of lines about that, but I concluded that from my meetings with people doing agent-based modeling, probably one could say that they are part of heterodox economics, maybe not all of them, but a large number of them. And then we have the issue of what about the Austrians or the neo-Austrians? Are they consider themselves to be part of heterodox economics? Are they really? And perhaps at the end of this first part, you'll be able to give a proper answer to that. If we look at just macroeconomics, so this is only looking at macroeconomics, so one can make this little these little distinctions. Keynes is there in the middle. Marx would be on its own there, giving rise to the Marxists, and then the radicals in the US for a long time, they would call themselves radicals instead of Marxists, although the term Marxism is now more fashionable since 2008. The French regulation school also is tied to the Marxists, but it's also tied to the Cambridge Keynesians, in particular the work of Kaldor, and Kaletsky more specifically. But Keynes gave rise to both the Cambridge Keynesians and the old Keynesians, Paul Samuelson, Tobin, Robert Solow, and then this gave rise to the new Keynesians. On the other hand, I consider the new classicals to be more on the monetarist, under the monetarist line. But what we see is that more recently, as you probably all know, there is this convergence of the two groups, which is called now the new consensus, where essentially you have the real business cycle view, which is essentially the new classical view, to which they have added a few fixed prices or a few rigidities. So that's how I see the Post-Keynesians here, looking at only, as I said, at the macroeconomics. Okay, here is maybe something that I find pretty interesting, because I think a lot of people get confused here. I think it's either you are heterodox or orthodox. So this is why we have this distinction. But on the other hand, I introduce here a new category, which I call the dissenters, which is a category that was introduced by a methodology. I think it was Backhouse. I have a memory blank here, but I think it was Backhouse. And he talks of dissenters. And now, in my opinion, you can have heterodox dissenters. So this is the red block here. Or you can have orthodox dissenters. So that's the pale green, which is here. And so the orthodox dissenters are people who basically use neoclassical theory, the neoclassical approach, neoclassical tools, but in a quite different way from the mainstream. The mainstream being what you find in textbooks, both at the undergraduate level, but also at the graduate level. So, what names do we, who are those orthodox dissenters? And I would say Milton Friedman, certainly in the 50s, was considered to be out there in left field, well, although he was very much on the right side of politics. But yeah, Milton Friedman was considered to be a very strange economist. And then you have these various Nobel Prize winners who I think we can say were dissenters. So Joe Stiglitz, certainly today. And then you have a few, I put a question mark. William Vickrey was an Orthodox dissenter when he was young. When he was older, he was clearly associated with the Post-Keynesians. Herbert Simon, the same. And And Keynes, we may wonder whether Keynes was he really heterodox, or was he just an orthodox dissenter? And that's room for a lot of discussions and controversies. So then we may ask, well, if we divide, as does Fred Lee, if we divide people, economists, into the heterodox school and the orthodox school, do these heterodox economists really have anything in common besides the fact that they are not really interested by neoclassical economics? And in my opinion, and that of a number of people, I think Fred Lee is one of them, Tony Lawson from the University of Cambridge as well, we believe that indeed there are commonalities between all those heterodox schools, these 15 or 16 heterodox schools that I mentioned a few slides before. So, but what happens is that some of these schools of thought are hyper-specialized in some fields, and so sometimes it looks as if they don't have much in common, but they do. And to find out what they have in common, you have to look at the presuppositions, the things that you don't question when you start doing a model, when you start thinking about the economic world. So what I'm going to do now is outline some of these presuppositions. So here I have 5. I mean, that's my way of looking at things. I think we can say that we can divide those presuppositions into 5 groups. I mean, someone like someone else may have 10 instead of just 5. Tony Lawson believes that the only one which is interesting is this one, is the first one, that every other presupposition follows from the idea of whether you are into realism or not. I should say that, I should explain perhaps where this comes from. I was asked about 23 or 24 years ago to make a presentation at the university, in Montreal, to make a presentation on Post-Keynesian economics to a group of philosophers of science. And I came up with you had to make a presentation, had to come up with a long paper. So my paper was about 40 pages long, trying to explain what Post-Keynesian economics was. And after this presentation, I was asked, well, this is very nice, but could you write a 4-page summary of your views? And then I realized, well, maybe I'm not quite at ease to explain exactly what Post-Keynesian economics is, but I can certainly find 4 features that identify what heterodox economics is compared to orthodox economics. So that's when I came up around 1990 with this. I had the first 4, and then a few years ago I added this political core. So I'm gonna go over very quickly on number 1, the number 3, number 4, number 5, and I'm gonna spend a little bit more time on the issue of holism versus atomicism or individualism. So let me just say a few things about the first 4 doublets, but going very fast. So I'm just going to... so instrumentalism versus realism. As I said, for Tony Lawson, who is supposed to be the expert on these issues, this is really the crucial matter. Personally, I am not fully at ease with what Tony Lawson writes. He makes a distinction between realistic and realism. And I am more at ease with saying, well, in saying that heterodox economists are interested in realistic assumptions. That's what they start from, and they want to tell a story starting from these realistic assumptions. Realism is something more philosophically more complicated. I am not at ease with it. But anyway, what's important is that the orthodox side, when you try to find out how do they model things and so on, well, basically they agree with Milton Friedman and his famous essay on methodology, which is considered by and large to be into instrumentalism. And so you have Robert Lucas, his former colleague, who says good models have to necessarily be artificial, abstract, patently unreal. Well, this is exactly what Milton Friedman was saying. Here you have Bliss at the time where we had the capital controversies saying, presenting his model and then saying, well, of course, that model does not represent reality and that is not its purpose. It doesn't say what the purpose is, but it's not supposed to be describing the real world. So I think one can summarize this pretty well by saying it is better to be precisely wrong rather than roughly right. I think that sums up pretty well the neoclassical view. Here I can say this without being hammered. And I have an example here. These financial engineers were using the so-called Gaussian copula function to price collateralized debt obligations, which is a compound of asset-based securities. And that was based on an index of credit default swaps market prices, instead of looking at the true default rates. So I would say that's a good example of instrumentalism, in the sense that you don't start from the reality. I mean, they could have looked at the actual default rates in the various cities in the US to try to give a price to those CDOs, but it was much simpler to use an index that was already existing. I think it was called ABX index. And so I think that, again, I think that's a good example of instrumentalism. Okay, so let me move on to rationality. Well, I would argue that neoclassical economists they start from some hyper-rationality. And wherever they go, in the end, even if they add some realistic features to their models, in the end, you even need more hyper-knowledge, more knowledge, more information. You need something which is even less realistic to be able to close the model. For instance, you can have a neoclassical model where you don't have perfect information, you have imperfect information, and therefore you need to search for this information. But for the model to get closed, you need even more knowledge than to start with. There's an infinite regress in all that. And so hyper-rationality is always there, whatever the starting implications. And here I have a quote from Philip Mirowski, which I think is very good. If you think about rational expectations, Orthodox macroeconomists came to conflate being rational with thinking like an orthodox economist. What this implies was that agents knew the one and only true model of the economy, which conveniently was stipulated as identical with neoclassical microeconomics. I mean, when the idea of rational expectations came out at the end of the 70s, early 80s, which is when I started teaching at the University of Ottawa in 1979, I was stunned. I was thinking, well, there's so much controversy about how the economy functions. How can we assume that all the people have the same opinion about what is the true model of the economy? Okay, so whereas in heterodox economics, we have much weaker assumptions about what rationality is or needs to be. For instance, we have rules of thumb and all that. So I would argue, when neoclassical economists look at the rules of thumb that we have in our models, if they ever look at them, then they would say, well, this is ad hoc. But I would argue the opposite. I would say what is ad hoc is this hypothesis of hyper-rationality in neoclassical economics. Scarcity versus production. Well, you have certainly seen in first year that economics is said to be the study of scarcity. In September, I asked my students, what is neoclassical economics? And so I got this answer here, which I thought was really neat. Those were fourth-year students. And most of the others didn't know what to answer. This was one of the best answers I got. On the other hand, you have this definition of what is economics. I know Fred Lee has his own. I'm not at ease with it. But I like the one by John Weeks. Economics is the study of the process by which society brings its available resources into production and the distribution of that production among its members. So it emphasizes production and it emphasizes distribution, and not so much efficiency or scarcity. The fifth component, the fifth doublet, was the political core, and there's a statement here by Keynes, which some of your professors may have shown to you before. So already Keynes, back in 1934, was arguing that, well, there are those who believe that the existing economic system in the long run is a self-adjusting system, but there will be groans, jerks, time lags, outside interference, but eventually you will be back to full equilibrium, meaning full employment. And on the other side of the gulf are those that reject the idea that the existing economic system is, in any significant sense, self-adjusting. So I think it represents pretty well a difference between heterodox and orthodox. I think that even Orthodox dissenters like Joseph Stiglitz or Paul Krugman would say that, well, if we could get rid of all these asymmetric information problems or rigid prices, then we would be in the nirvana of full employment. And finally, here's the fifth doublet. So it's holism or organicism versus individualism or atomicism, which means starting always from the individual unit. And so one way to look at that is to say, well, in heterodox economics, and in particular in post-Keynesian economics, we look and we are very much interested by macroeconomic paradoxes, or what some other people call errors of composition. And here I have a list of these various macro paradoxes. So the first one, you know, certainly the paradox of thrift, but there is also the paradox of cost, which is that if you have higher real wages and therefore smaller profit margins, still this may lead to higher profit rates. So this was mentioned by Kaleski and emphasized by Bob Rothorn. The paradox of public deficits, well, here at UMKC, I don't think I need to emphasize this. The paradox of tranquility. Stability is destabilizing. Certainly people here know about this. The paradox of debt, which is the topic of some controversy between myself and Randy Ray. Efforts to deleverage might lead to higher leverage ratios. So as firms try to reduce their debt ratios, in fact, as they do so, it may lead to the opposite result. So of course you can look at it the other way around. As firms try to raise their debt ratios, have higher leverage, they may not actually succeed in raising the actual debt ratio. So this was emphasized by Irving Fisher, but also by Joseph Steindl. The paradox of liquidity, the paradox of risk were certainly in the midst of the financial crisis. We all saw that efforts to become more liquid were in fact transforming liquid assets into illiquid ones. As you were trying to get rid of your asset-based securities, which everybody thought were highly liquid, then suddenly they were not anymore. The paradox of risk was emphasized by Vojnilower in a paper published in 1980 in the Brookings Papers on Economic Activity. Vojnilower was a Minsky fan, and he was working in a bank or in some investment fund. And he was emphasizing then that the possibility of individual risk cover would in fact lead to more risk overall. So each individual would have the feeling that, well, okay, I'm purchasing this credit default swap, which will protect me in case this bond defaults. And so everybody believes that he or she is better protected against these default risks, but in the end, it turned out that well, this protection was not there whatsoever. It was in fact creating even more risk because of these firms issuing the CDS were potentially putting themselves into a default situation. And then the one I added recently is the paradox of profit-led demand, which comes from the work that I did with a group of people for the International Labour Office. That's related to all those profit-led, wage-led empirical studies, where what happens is that if you lower wages or real wages, this might lead, or this is likely to lead to slower growth in each country, even though all countries seem to be profit-led. So domestically, they may be profit or wage-led. Some countries may only be profit-led if you take into account exports and imports. But if all countries lower real wages simultaneously, because the entire earth is a closed economy, then this will have a negative impact on the economy. So that's a particular Post-Keynesian paradox. People at the New School usually believe that all countries are profit-led. I said that in Boston 2 weeks ago in a room full of New School graduates. Okay, so Edward Fulbrook is the one that I mentioned. He had a small, kind of 3-page, 4-page paper identifying what he believes to be the new paradigm, and he had 10 items. 5 of them were similar to the ones I mentioned among my presuppositions, and then he had 5 more, and some of them you would, like radical uncertainty, certainly you could associate with Post-Keynesian economics. This is just to say that I'm not stuck on my definition. I have 5, others have 1, others have 10. You know, it's a matter of opinion or feelings. So, to sum up this part, I would say that heterodox economics is distinct from orthodox economics. Certainly from the methodology point of view, you can argue so. There are differences of opinions among post-Keynesians. There are differences of opinions between Marxists and post-Keynesians. But remember, the neoclassical authors also have their own battles. Krugman certainly doesn't have the same opinion as John B. Taylor, although they both seem to be using a model which is very similar. So it's normal to have disagreements between individuals in different, even within the same heterodox school. Okay, so let's move on to part 2, which deals with post-Keynesian economics. I think I would argue that the realization that what the Cambridge economists were doing, Cambridge Keynesian economists were doing, was different from what the American Keynesian economists, the old Keynesians, were doing, came up in the 60s and in the 70s. First, as a consequence of the Cambridge controversies, and secondly, as a consequence of the fact that neoclassical Keynesians started adopting monetarism. And so this seemed, that's when people in Cambridge who were at least one brand of the first post-Keynesians truly realized that, okay, what we are doing is not the same as what these other guys are doing. I mean, because before that, they thought, well, we're all doing economics, and you know, we're not fully aware that what was being done in America was different from what was being done in that unique university in Cambridge. In the mid-70s, 80s, this was what Giuseppe Fontana calls the romantic age, in the sense that there was a feeling among at least some post-Keynesians that eventually post-Keynesian economics would replace neoclassical economics. So it didn't turn out like this at all. There were big efforts to have synthesis of what post-Keynesian economics was. Journals were created, so there was an institutionalization of post-Keynesian economics. Myself, in 1975, I was first introduced to Cambridge economics, of post-Keynesian economics, and the Cambridge controversies when I was a 4th-year honors student in my university. And at the very same time came out the article by Kriegel and Eichner in the Journal of Economic Literature. And it had a large impact on my thinking and my ambition to go into post-Keynesian economics. And certainly I think that even today it's worth reading this article of 1975. The 80s were followed by an age of uncertainty, again using the expression of Giuseppe Fontana. In the 1990s, people were rediscovering the writings of John Maynard Keynes. There was a lot of work on the history of economic thought, a lot of work on methodology. I have nothing against methodology. This is all I've been talking for the first half hour here. But I think too many people were doing methodology. I mean, you don't want most of the post-Keynesians doing history of economic thought or methodology. You want some people to do it, but not all. But this changed in the 2000s, around, you know, going to conferences, reading the papers in the journals. One realized that there was a move away from this. I call this the age of policy, in the sense that there were lots of papers devoted to economic policy. empirical work, and so on. And so I think we have a much better balance now than we had 15 years ago. So what is peculiar about post-Keynesian economics? Well, part of post-Keynesian economics is not peculiar in the sense that it has the same 5 presuppositions that I mentioned a few minutes ago. But what is specific about post-Keynesian economics, I think, are those 2 things. I mean, there are other things which are important, but I think those 2 stand out if you try to compare, for instance, post-Keynesian economics with, say, Marxist economics. The first one is the principle of effective demand, arguing that economies are basically demand-led. They may be supply constraints that hit at some point. This is mentioned by Kaletsky, this is mentioned by John Robinson. But most of the time, whether we're talking about developing countries or whether we're talking about industrialized nations, the constraint is from the demand side. And this is true both in the short run and in the long run. If you're talking to, say, new Keynesians or most Marxists, they would easily agree that in the short run the economy is demand-led, but they will argue that in the long run it is supply-led. It's the supply side that dominates. For instance, for a Marxist, he or she will argue that, well, what determines the rate of growth will be the propensity to save and the normal rate of profit. That if any of these things increase, then you will have a higher rate of growth, whereas post-Keynesians would say exactly the opposite. And so, if you want to sum it up, you would just say, well, investment causes saving rather than the reverse. Then the second key feature, I think, of post-Keynesian economics is this emphasis on the importance of time, the irreversibility of time, historical time, and so on. So post-Keynesians have always emphasized the fact that if you're talking about equilibria, you've got to tell a story, or you have to model the transition from one position to the next. You just cannot say, well, this is the equilibrium, then there's some change, and then we're up to some other position. No, you've got to tell, you have to explain how you move from one to the other. So I think that for post-Keynesians, explaining the transition, explaining the traverse is very important. I think one of the contributions of the work that I did with Wynne Godley is precisely that, is that in our stock flow consistent model, when we do the simulations, we've got this traverse. And so what happens in the short run may be quite different from what happens in the long run. Linked to this importance of time is path dependence, the fact that you can have multiple equilibria. So I think those are the 2 key distinguishing features of post-Keynesian economics. There are other features which are considered to be important in the literature. Radical uncertainty certainly being emphasized by people like Paul Davidson. The fact that we are in a monetary production economy is certainly something which you have been told here. I think Fred Lee and Alfred Eichner have emphasized that one cannot rely on neoclassical microeconomics as a foundation for understanding what happens in the world or for understanding macroeconomics. And so we need alternative microeconomics, which in fact exist, and where there is very little substitution effects. A diversity of methods and theories. I don't know if this is an advantage or a disadvantage, but this is certainly something which defines post-Keynesian economics. And finally, the fact that institutions make a difference. This is also, I think, something which is emphasized by post-Keynesian economists. I could have added here, maybe I should, the fact that income distribution is also something which is considered to be highly important by post-Keynesian economists. So it is certainly a key feature of post-Keynesian economics, but for instance, the Marxists also believe it is a key feature. So it's not a distinguishing key feature. Perhaps it is with respect to neoclassical economics. So I'll skip the shape of cost curves. I'll assume all of you have taken a course with Fred Lee. Maybe something that will interest you more is this five-way typology of post-Keynesian economics. The standard way of describing post-Keynesian economics is to have three categories. So, for instance, in the famous paper published 25 years ago by Harcourt and Omar Hamouda, they distinguish what they called fundamentalist Keynesians or American Keynesians, the Chalessians and the Straussians. But then at the end of their paper, Hamouda and Harcourt are kind of wondering, well, we've done these description, but we don't know where to put Caldor, we don't know where to put John Robinson, we don't know where to put Wynne Godley, we don't know where to put Goodwin. So I think we need a more fancy typology, and this is why I've added those two, the institutionalist post-Keynesians and the Caldorians. So, I know you're reading this very keenly already. I would say that to a large extent, the different groups are focused on different fields. So here I agree with Tony Lawson. What distinguishes the different heterodox schools are often the field of economics they are interested. And I think it's also true to some extent when we speak of the 5 different strands of post-Keynesian economics. So what I call the fundamentalist Keynesians, or perhaps a nicer term would be the financial Keynesians, would be, well, they focus a lot on money, finance, liquidity preference, uncertainty, and methodology. And so I would put Davidson, Minsky, Jan Kriegel, Vicky Chick, Sheila Dow, Giuseppe Fontana, I would put them in this category. The Chalessians are more interested in pricing, growth, economic cycles, theories of employment, income distribution. So people like Malcolm Sawyer, Amit Badouri, Amitav Dutt, Robert Blecker, Steve Fazzari, who is, I'm told, is supposed to come here and talk to you in September. I'm sure you will very much enjoy his presentation. Those are the Chalessians. By the way, about Fazzari, the funny thing is that he has published with Hubbard, this pretty right-wing economist, and so often people think Fazzari is a neoclassical author. They don't realize he's a Chalessian post-Keynesian. The Straussians are more concerned with input-output model, capital theory, technical choice, relative prices, so models with several sectors. The institutionalists are more concerned, of course, with institutions, pricing behavior, behavioral economics. So I would put Fred Lee, Randy Ray, and the whole of modern monetary theory in this branch. I would put the two Galbraith, the father and the son, in this category. And finally, the Caldorians are concerned with growth models, also concerned with money, international trade, a lot of work on that, productivity growth, and I would put my former co-author Wynne Godley there, Third Wall, John McCombie, and Tom Polly in this Caldorian category. Then there are some people that one doesn't know where to put because they go across all the strands. So Philip Arestis would certainly be there. Edward Nell. I think Matthew Forstater would be in this category, going across all going across the whole spectrum of post-Keynesian economics. Right. Okay, so I have a bit of time. I started late. I started 15 minutes late. So I have a bit of time to discuss this thing. Why do neoclassical theories always seem to be supported by empirical evidence? Well, okay, I have that. Empirical evidence seems to give support to many of these constructs, the natural rate of unemployment, crowding out effects, the way interest rates move up and down, inflation being the result of a larger stock of money, and so forth, and so on. So, one important construct which seems often to be given some empirical support is the well-behaved neoclassical production function, with its first derivative being positive, the second derivative being negative, and the better known example of that is the Cobb-Douglas production function. So, in the 1960s, as I said, there was this big controversy on capital theory. Probably Fred Lee has talked to you about this. And what was shown and what was agreed at the end of the 1960s was that, the story which is told by neoclassical economists is only valid in a model where you only have one sector. As soon as you have two, and you include fixed coefficients with two sectors, the story doesn't run anymore. And so it would seem a little bit surprising that running regressions on the aggregate production function would allow you to give support to the Cobb-Douglas production function or any other production function, neoclassical production function, like the constant elasticity of substitution production function. What was shown during the Cambridge controversies, for those who might not know, was that, whereas the neoclassical model will tell you that the labor demand function would have a negative relationship between the real wage rate and labor relative to the number of machines you would have in the economy, it was shown that if you have some continuous change in technology in a two-sector model with, say, an investment good and a consumption good, you could either derive a labor demand curve that could have this shape, or you can even derive a labor demand curve that would have that other shape. So it's not necessarily downward sloping. So one was shown by Garagani in 1970, and the other one was shown in a paper by Garagani in 1992. So what was the response of neoclassical economics to this? Well, there were 4 or 5 responses. One was, we don't need this, we have general equilibrium theory. Second one was, we have faith in neoclassical theory. So that was written in 1969. And then the most enduring response, I would say, by neoclassical economists is that it works, therefore it exists. So we can run regressions on Cobb-Douglas production functions, and if they are properly specified, if we introduce a rate of utilization in them, then they will give pretty good results. And even some of the claims of neoclassical microeconomics will be sustained. For instance, it will turn out that the output elasticity of labor will turn out to be roughly equal to the share of wages, which is a consequence that you can draw under some hypothesis from neoclassical microeconomics. So it would seem to work pretty well. Well, as others among you know, there was a critique by Anwar Sheikh of this already in the early 1970s. And I mean, here I have a picture which was shown by Anwar Sheikh 20 years after that, in the 1990s, and where he argued, well, even if, suppose we have this fixed coefficient economy. So by construction, we have an economy which has fixed coefficients. So there's no substitution whatsoever. Well, and this economy has some technical progress. So as the economy is moving forward, the real wage, or if you want, output per labor, can move from Y0 to Y1 to Y3. So the true relationship that one would be observed, that exists according to the construction of this model, is in fact this straight line which I have here, which relates the capital labor ratio to the output to labor ratio, or the productivity per labor. So normally it would be a straight line. But what the neoclassical economists would argue, or how they would, I mean, empirically what they would come up with would be that, hey, we have a neoclassical production function which has the standard characteristic. It has a first derivative which is positive, so the curve is rising, but the second derivative would be negative, so that's why it would reach a maximum. And so we would be starting, say, at capital ratio K0 here. So you would find this number here, Y0 there. And then as the economy would be growing, you would have a new capital ratio K2. So what the neoclassicals would say is that, well, this is the output that we would achieve with this higher capital to labor ratio, but the distance between the top, the straight line here and the curved line there, that would be technical progress. So that's how it would be interpreted. So that is basically Anwar Sheikh's new critique. And as you know, in the 1970s, Anwar Sheikh argued that the reason for which the neoclassical production function was working is that, in fact, it was when you were doing empirical work on it, you were, in fact, reproducing the national accounts. So there was no way that you could dismiss, if you were properly integrating technical progress, there was no way you could dismiss neoclassic. You could say that this production function did not exist. A second proof, which I find more powerful, was provided by John McCombie in 2001 in a paper in the Journal of Post-Keynesian Economics. So what John McCombie was saying is, he says, okay, let's start with this Cobb-Douglas production function, where output is a function of labor and capital, and A and B are the technical coefficients, which are supposed to represent, A is supposed to represent the output elasticity of labor, and B is supposed to represent the output elasticity of capital. He says, okay, let's have a simulation, doing numbers, doing small errors, and then make a regression out of that. And let's start with the physical data. So you do that, and you will get indeed a regression giving you a very high R squared, and you will find indeed that the coefficients that you obtain in the regression will indeed be very close to the output elasticities, which you had assumed to start with. So what he did, he said, okay, let's assume that the output elasticity of labor, as he was constructing this simulated model, is 0.25. And then he says, okay, now in reality, when we as economists have to get data, we don't get the data straightforwardly from the number of widgets that we are producing or from the number of machines that we have. We have to use values. We get the values from the national accounts, and then we deflate in order to try to find what is the production function. So then he takes the same simulated world that he started with, and now he puts in a price, assuming there's a markup. And in this markup, he assumes that the share of wages is approximately 75%, and the share of capital is approximately 25%. And then he does the deflating, and he runs again the regression on this deflated data. And what does he find? He finds that the coefficient that he obtains, which is supposed to measure A here, which is supposed to measure the output elasticity of labor, he finds out that it's equal to 0.75. So what he has shown, what John McCombie has shown, and this is explained again in his recent book published last year with Jesus Felipe, he explains, well, what he shows is that whenever our neoclassical friends are making regressions on, trying to compute what this production function looks like, they always start from value data, so they must deflate. Therefore, what happens is that what they are really computing is the share of wages and the share of capital. And it has nothing to do with technical coefficients. So, if someone is showing to you, oh, well, this is the production function in Zimbabwe or whatever, and finds that the technical coefficient in Zimbabwe, this little a is equal to 0.60, it simply means that in Zimbabwe the share of wages is 60%. It doesn't tell you anything about substitution effects or output elasticities of the various factors of production. So this is why I say once more that neoclassical economics is really about being precisely wrong rather than being roughly right. And I presented this to my colleagues a few years back, because you can do that also with labor demand functions. I had a workshop in my department, and then I had a discussion with one of the persons who is most open to discussion. And I told him, well, what do you think? What are you going to do now? This person is doing computable general equilibrium models, applying this for countries in Africa and so on. And he said, well, I understand what you're saying, but, that's the only thing I can do. If I don't use the neoclassical production function, then there's nothing I can say anymore. So I'm going to continue going on as if I had not seen your workshop. So this is the reality. Okay, so this puts in jeopardy almost all of neoclassical economics, or at least almost all of neoclassical macroeconomics. Prescott here, who is, I wonder if I think he got a Nobel Prize, I'm not sure.
There is no Nobel Prize, it's the Swiss Bank Prize.
Well, yeah, it's the Swedish.
Yeah.
It's the Bank of Sweden Prize in Economics in the honor of Mr. Nobel.
Yeah, Kendall and Prescott got the pseudo Nobel Prize back in the day there somewhere.
Yeah, about 10 or 15 years. So Prescott said the neoclassical production function is the cornerstone of neoclassical theory and is used in virtually all applied analysis. So, here you have a list of all the things that neoclassical economists do, and which, in my opinion, don't hold water. because the neoclassical production function just doesn't hold water. This is true even for, if you're computing what is the effect of changing this tax rate on the, or that tax rate, income tax rate, if you increase it, what's going to be the impact on the labor supply function? None of this holds up. Okay, I'm almost through. That was the base, looking at the production function. What about another issue which I think is important, which is the publication bias? As some of you perhaps know, there's a lot of data fishing, or it's also called data mining or data messaging. And this is done by everybody. I mean, whether you are Orthodox or Heterodox, everybody does it. At the pizza, I can tell you a story about this. In my own case. I mean, there in some fields, I would say that econometrics works well. For instance, if you try to estimate salaries of hockey players, it works pretty well. I mean, it doesn't matter whether you remove an observation or add, you always get more or less the same results. But in macroeconomics, it can make a big difference. So the most famous example now is this Reinhardt and Rogoff study, which was published in the Papers of Proceedings of the American Economic Review, which was claiming that if you had a high public debt to GDP ratio, one above 90%, then this meant that the growth rate of these countries had to fall down to 0%, or roughly so, whereas the other countries that had ratios below 90%, they could grow at 2.5% or something like that. And then it was shown by a student from UMass and supervised by Robert Polin. I'm not sure, was Ash a student also?
No, he's faculty
as well. So they found, in fact, coded mistakes, omitted entries, unconventional weighting, and if you corrected all that, then you were back to a rate of growth which was very close to those of countries that had ratios below 90%. So I think that's a typical example, but in general, as Tom Stanley here says, reviewers and editors of academic journals may be predisposed to accept papers consistent with the conventional view. And what Tom Stanley does is called meta-regression analysis. So he's doing regressions on regressions. He does that. Many other people do that. I mean, there's more than 100 studies now, I think, in economics that use this technique. I'm very bad in econometrics, but if some of you are good, I would certainly recommend that that could be a topic for a dissertation. So what Tom Stanley says is that, well, I mean, basically what he does, he looks at, suppose you look at studies on the Nauru. You want to know whether inflation, if expected inflation goes up, does it have a one-on-one impact on the actual rate of inflation? So the coefficient that you're looking at is the coefficient in front of expected inflation, and you would expect the true, well, is the true value equal to 1? I mean, so when there is no bias in publishing, what happens is that you have symmetric results. The best studies are those that have the highest precision, which means that the standard error is very small. So 1 over the standard error is very large. So the best studies are those that are, in this area, and most likely they are the ones that give you the true value that you're looking for. And all the other studies are not so good, maybe because it didn't have enough data, or because there was a lot of data mining, data messaging, and so on. But if there is no bias in research, then all these studies should be spread out around the true value. The graph on the bottom is showing you what happens when there is bias. So suppose, for instance, that you are looking at the elasticity of some elasticity for water, for instance, and you think, most neoclassical economists would say, well, there's a lot of substitution. People can substitute water for Coke, Pepsi, and everything. So they would tend to believe that the elasticity would be very high. So all those people doing data mining, data messaging, they would find results around here. That would be the bad studies. Whereas the good ones would probably find the true value, which is probably close to zero. For birds, in fact, it was found that it was close to zero. Some neoclassical colleagues have looked at that. Okay, so what does, and I'm through here, I think. What does meta-regression analysis show? It shows that there is severe publication bias in about half of the fields that have been studied through this methodology, which means that in half of the cases, we were rather, this graph is the one that looked most like what they could observe, rather than the one on top. These studies have falsified the claim that government deficits lead to reduced household spending, which is one of the reasons for which people object to the government running deficits. And those studies have shown conclusively, this was 10 years ago, much before all the things that happened during the financial crisis, they have falsified the claim that there exists a natural rate of unemployment towards which the economy converges, and it has falsified the claim that I was talking about, that expected inflation leads to a one-on-one increase in the rate of inflation. So this whole Nairu theory, which is at the heart of neoclassical macroeconomics, at least according to these meta-regression analysis, is completely falsified. I would say that from your standpoint, knowing that neoclassical economics can really create a lot of havoc, it is really important for us post-Keynesians to keep working within the post-Keynesian tradition. And it certainly is important to have students like you. You have a very important role for the future in doing work which is in an alternative tradition and that brings in alternative views in economics. Thank you.